I didn't get angry when my daughter-in-law handed me a to-do list for my own house on Christmas Eve. I just smiled. She had no idea that the woman she'd spent 9 years treating like dirt had just turned down a $340 million buyout offer, and tonight everyone at the dinner table was going to find out. My son Caleb and his wife Natalie sat at my kitchen table, treating me like hired help. For 9 years, Natalie had acted like I was made of thin air. When I spoke, she stared at her phone. When I poured her coffee, she took the mug without a single word of thanks. I'm 60 years old, a widow of 5 years, and I own a solid, paid-off brick colonial in a quiet suburb just outside of Philadelphia. I am not weak. I am just a quiet person. But even my patience has a hard limit. Caleb had changed ever since he married Natalie. He'd become passive, a shadow of his former self, just nodding along to whatever she dictated. On this particular December afternoon, they were over to discuss the upcoming Christmas holidays. Natalie had already laid out a detailed list on the table. It was a list of chores for me. I was expected to roast the Christmas dinner, decorate the entire house handle, all the grocery shopping, and then move up to my tiny attic guest room for a week so Natalie's parents could have my large, comfortable master bedroom on the first floor. "It's just the best way to handle things, Martha," Natalie said, without looking up, casually inspecting her manicure. "It's not like you actually use all this space anyway. This house is way too big for one person." Caleb stared guiltily into his coffee mug and stayed quiet. He didn't say a single word in my defense. They thought that because I was older and living alone, they could just colonize my home and my time however they saw fit. They saw me as a free maid, a grandmother on demand to be used for the holidays and forgotten right after. I didn't feel rage. I felt a deep, cold clarity. I smoothed down the tablecloth and looked at them. Natalie gave a thin, smug smile, believing she'd already gotten her way. She had no idea that months ago I had stopped playing the role of the helpless widow. I gave a slow nod and said, "I understand." I didn't argue. I never do. Arguing just wastes energy that is much better spent taking action. The next morning, I set out to rearrange my life with pure practical focus. The first step involved the money. Years ago, my late husband and I had set up a joint account for Caleb, which I supplemented every month with a generous allowance to help him out. It was meant to be a stepping stone, but Natalie had started using it exclusively for her expensive weekend getaways and boutique shopping sprees. I drove down to my bank in the town center. The branch manager had known me for decades. With a few clicks, I canceled the recurring transfer and severed the link to the account. It was my right. It was my money. By the time I got home, a text from Caleb was already waiting on my phone. He asked if there had been some kind of banking error. I typed out a brief reply, "No error, times change." After that, I went down to my home office. My husband had left me a boutique software firm, specializing in global logistics systems, which I had been quietly running from home since his passing. No one in the family ever bothered to ask about it. To Natalie, I was just an old woman who fooled around on the computer. They didn't know that the algorithms my husband and I designed were now being utilized by major shipping and freight companies worldwide. I worked every single day with disciplined focus to optimize those systems. When Natalie called me that evening to remind me about the grocery shopping for Christmas dinner, I kept it brief. Her voice was sharp, visibly irritated about the missing funds in the bank account she'd discovered earlier that afternoon. I didn't interrupt her. I just listened and let her vent. At the end of her rant, I simply said, "I have everything under control, Natalie. I'll see you on Christmas Eve. As I hung up, I looked at my computer screen. There, glowing in the dark, was the confirmation for a private meeting with my attorney in January. The Monday before Christmas, I changed the rules in my own home. Up until then, Caleb and Natalie had a key to my front door. They came and went as they pleased, raiding my fridge or dropping off their dirty laundry in my basement washing machine. That ended today. I called a local locksmith, and within 2 hours, the deadbolts on the front and back doors were replaced. When Natalie showed up unannounced that afternoon to drop off some bins of holiday decorations, I heard her key jam in the lock. She rattled the handle violently before aggressively buzzing the doorbell. I opened the door just a crack, secured by the old safety chain. Natalie looked at me completely flabbergasted, her face flushed red from the winter cold and sheer irritation. Caleb stood right behind her, hoisting a heavy plastic bin. He looked at me with total confusion. I met their eyes calmly, keeping my face completely expressionless. I had the locks changed. For security reasons, I said, my voice low and steady. "And where is our new key?" Natalie demanded, already holding out an impatient hand. "There isn't a new key for you," I replied evenly. "You are guests in this house, Natalie. If you want to visit, you're more than welcome to call ahead and ring the bell. But the open door policy is over. I need my privacy." Caleb swallowed hard, but Natalie just scoffed in disbelief. She wasn't used to me drawing boundaries. She clearly thought this was just a temporary tantrum from a lonely woman. She still had no clue that this was just the beginning and that the balance of power in this family had already shifted irrevocably. I closed the door in their faces and went back to work. The days leading up to Christmas Eve were unusually quiet. Natalie tried calling me multiple times, presumably to confront me about the locks or to pressure me about the cutoff allowance. I let every single call go to voicemail. I wasn't obligated to justify myself or let someone yell at me over the phone. I handled my business in silence. My entire focus was locked onto the massive deal that had consumed my life for the past few months. On December 23rd, Caleb and Natalie stopped by again, this time properly announcing themselves beforehand. Natalie was visibly trying to mask her fury, but her eyes were ice cold. They sat down on the living room sofa. Right away, I noticed Natalie reaching to crank the thermostat all the way up, just like she always did. I walked over, caught her hand, and quietly set it back to a normal temperature. "It's pretty chilly in here, Martha," Natalie remarked with a mocking undertone. "Did you run out of heating money since you froze the bank accounts? Are we supposed to sit here and freeze?" She thought she'd hit a nerve. She assumed I was financially ruined and desperately pinching pennies. Caleb glanced anxiously between the two of us, completely powerless to diffuse the tension. I sat down in the armchair opposite them. "I just don't believe in wasting resources on people who don't appreciate my hospitality or my property," I answered calmly. I didn't offer them coffee, and I didn't bring out any homemade cookies. The room remained crisp, and the atmosphere grew even colder. Natalie bit her lip, thoroughly annoyed, and sharply changed the subject. "Tomorrow is Christmas Eve. We expect dinner to be on the table at exactly 8 o'clock. My parents are coming straight here after church." I took a sip of my water and said simply, "Don't worry about the food." Dear, quiet, revenge family, we wanted to take a moment to thank you for spending your time with us. We know your time is valuable, and we never take that for granted. We also want to be open with our community AI tools, may sometimes help with parts of our creative workflow, but every story you hear is carefully selected, edited, reviewed, and produced by our team before it reaches you. As our channel currently has limited monetization support, some viewers have asked how they can help. if you would like to support Quiet Revenge. Even with the price of a small cup of coffee, it would help us continue bringing meaningful stories to this community. Patreon, https://www.patreon.com/Quiet Revenge Family, Ko-fi, https://ko-fi.com/The Story Family, PayPal, https://www.paypal.com/PayPal me/Kan Thank you for walking this journey with us. Christmas Eve arrived, and with it, Natalie's parents. They walked into my home with a palpable arrogance that they had clearly passed down to their daughter. They gave me a dismissive nod, hung up their coats, and marched straight into the brightly lit dining room. Natalie shot me a triumphant look as I stood by the stove. She assumed that despite my little rebellions over the last few weeks, I would ultimately fall into line and play the dutiful servant just like I had every year before. The dinner started off in their usual fashion. Natalie talked non-stop about her brother's corporate promotion, the new designer furniture they were eyeing, and their lavish vacation plans for the upcoming year. No one acknowledged me at all, except for Caleb, who occasionally threw me a worried glance. He sensed that something was fundamentally different, but he didn't have the courage to break through the facade. When the main course was cleared, Caleb poured more wine. He tried to steer the conversation to a more neutral topic to ease the thick tension lingering in the room. "So, Mom," he said loudly, turning to face me, "how's that little computer logistics thing of yours going? Do you even have the time and energy for that kind of hobby at your age?" Natalie let out a short, mocking laugh before I could even open my mouth. "Oh, Caleb, please. Your mom just clicks around on old websites. It's not a real business you can actually live off of." Her mother nodded in agreement, taking a long sip of her wine. I set my dessert fork down, folded my hands neatly on the table, and looked Natalie dead in the eye. The moment I had spent months preparing for in total secrecy had finally arrived. "Actually," I said, my voice so quiet and commanding that the clinking of silverware stopped instantly, "I finished up with that company last week." Natalie raised a condescending eyebrow. "Oh, really? Ran out of steam?" "Martha, honestly, it's probably for the best. At your age, you should leave the heavy lifting to younger people and just focus on resting." She started to turn back to her mother, but I kept speaking. "No, Natalie, I sold the company. To be precise, last Tuesday, I turned down a final acquisition offer from the Nexarian Group out of Atlanta." Caleb froze mid-motion. Natalie's father knit his brows. "The Nexarian Group, that's a multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate. What would they want with your little software setup?" "They wanted to buy our global logistics algorithms," I explained thoroughly, letting my gaze drift across every face at the table. "Their opening offer was $280 million. Last week, they bumped it up to $340 million. A sudden suffocating silence fell over the dining room. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Natalie's smug smile froze completely on her face. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. Caleb stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. His wine glass trembled so badly that a few drops spilled onto the table. $340 million. Caleb stammered, his voice cracking from the sheer shock. "Mom, that's impossible." I turned it down. I continued without raising my voice a single decibel. "Because they wanted to lay off the domestic workforce and dissolve our brand name. Instead, I signed a different deal yesterday. A private equity consortium out of New York bought a 49% stake for $150 million. I retain absolute controlling interest. The color drained from Natalie's face. She turned the color of printer paper, gasping for air like a fish out of water. Nobody moved. Natalie's mother set her glass down so unsteadily that red wine splashed onto the white tablecloth, but nobody cared. Natalie just stared at me, completely unable to form a sentence. The arrogant, condescending spark in her eyes was entirely gone. In its place was naked horror and a sudden, ugly flash of greed. You have millions of dollars!" Natalie finally whispered, her voice high-pitched and completely strained. "And you're making us pinch pennies. You cut off the allowance while you're sitting on a mountain of cash. That is incredibly selfish." She tried to sound aggressive, but her voice shook with manic energy. I looked at her with pure indifference. "It's my mountain of cash, Natalie. My husband and I worked ourselves to the bone for 30 years to build it. In the last 9 years, you haven't asked me how I was doing a single time, let alone what I did for a living. You treated me like a piece of furniture in my own home." Caleb lowered his head in deep shame. He looked incredibly small in that moment. "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us?" he asked quietly. "Because you never listened, Caleb," I replied, completely devoid of bitterness. "Every single time I tried to talk about my life, your wife changed the subject or ignored me entirely. And you looked the other way. I only stopped talking when I realized my words meant absolutely nothing to you. You didn't want to see me, so I made myself invisible." Natalie swallowed hard. The realization was finally washing over her that she had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. Natalie scrambled to regain control of the situation. She forced a strained, desperate smile that didn't come anywhere near her eyes. "Martha, honey, this is obviously a huge, wonderful surprise. Look, we didn't mean anything by those jokes. We just wanted to take some stress off your shoulders. And Caleb is your only son after all. Family sticks together through thick and thin, right?" I rose calmly from the table. I wasn't angry. I was just being resolute. I walked over to the buffet cabinet and pulled out a document I had prepared earlier that afternoon. It wasn't a formal legal summons, just a simple, unmistakable list. I slid the paper across the table, right in front of Caleb. "That is a breakdown of all the financial gifts and down payment loans I've given you over the last few years. I own exactly 60% of the house you currently live in, since I provided the entire down payment. I am selling my share to a private real estate investment firm in January, unless you can buy me out completely before then." Natalie gasped. "You can't do that. Where are we supposed to get that kind of money? We have a mortgage. We have bills." "That is no longer my problem, Natalie," I said smoothly. "You wanted to take over my master bedroom and banish me to the attic. Now you might want to start figuring out where you're going to live. My money is officially closed to you." Caleb just stared at the paper. He didn't offer a single word of protest. Natalie's father cleared his throat awkwardly, looking at the floor. The Christmas Eve dinner ended in a freezing, abrupt silence. Natalie and her parents frantically packed up their belongings. There were no hugs, no holiday wishes. Natalie couldn't even bring herself to look me in the eye as she hurried out the front door. Caleb was the last one left standing at the threshold. He looked at me exhausted and visibly broken by the hard truth he'd faced tonight. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said softly. "I know, Caleb," I replied, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder for a brief moment. "But apologies don't change the reality of things. You need to learn to speak up for yourself. Until you do, you're living someone else's life, and you're always going to be miserable." He gave a quiet nod and walked out into the cold December night. As the heavy front door clicked shut, a wave of profound, liberating relief washed over me. The house was empty, but for the first time in years, it felt like my home again. I went into the kitchen, loaded the dishes into the dishwasher, and poured myself a glass of water. There was no big dramatic breakdown, no tears. Just the absolute certainty that I had successfully defended my life. The next morning, Christmas Day, I slept in until 9 o'clock. No rush, no expectations, and no holiday feast to prepare for ungrateful people. I brewed a fresh cup of coffee and just took in the absolute quiet. My life belonged to me again, and I had taken back the reins. 3 months after that unforgettable Christmas, the dust had finally settled. Caleb and Natalie were forced to sell their house since they couldn't afford to buy out my share. They ended up moving into a much smaller rental apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a brutal lesson for them, but an absolutely vital one. Caleb calls me now every first Sunday of the month. He genuinely asks how I'm doing, and he actually listens to the answer. Natalie's name hasn't come up in our conversations, even once. I've been putting my wealth to good use. I started a small foundation that provides grants and mentorship to older women looking to launch their own businesses in technology and software development. I pass down my knowledge, give guest lectures, and enjoy the genuine respect of people who value me for my intellect and capabilities, not my bank account. Sometimes I sit out on my back patio in the evening, sipping a glass of wine and watching the birds in the yard. Having money in the bank brings peace of mind, sure, but it isn't the most important thing. The most beautiful thing is the intoxicating feeling of self-determination. I proved to myself that you don't have to let people make you invisible just because you're getting older. When people underestimate you, you don't need to get loud or threaten them with lawyers. You just have to act with unwavering resolve. Protect your own peace and rewrite the rules of the game on your own terms. I spent my whole life working quietly in the background, but in the end, I wrote the final chapter exactly the way I wanted to. And that is the absolute best plot twist I could have ever asked for. Dear Quiet Revenge family, we wanted to take a moment to thank you for spending your time with us. We know your time is valuable, and we never take that for granted. We also want to be open with our community. AI tools may sometimes help with parts of our creative workflow, but every story you hear is carefully selected, edited, reviewed, and produced by our team before it reaches you. As our channel currently has limited monetization support, some viewers have asked how they can help. If you would like to support Quiet Revenge, even with the price of a small cup of coffee, it would help us continue bringing meaningful stories to this community. Patreon, https://www.patreon.com/quietrevenge family. Ko-fi, https://ko-fi.com/thestoryfamily. PayPal, https://www.paypal.com/paypalme/Kunhuangmin. Thank you for walking this journey with us.